بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم طلاب. اليوم محاضرتنا راح تكون الأخيرة وراح نتكلم بها about the joints of upper limb. So in this lecture we are going to list upper limb joints, to describe their class, to describe their anatomy, to list their movements and the muscles conducting them, to list nerve and blood supply of these joints, and finally to study sectional anatomy of elbow joint. The first joint is the sternoclavicular joint, which is a plain synovial joint in which the medial end of the clavicle articulates with the manubrium sterni and first costal cartilage. The joint cavity is surrounded by tough fibrous tissue, which is called the capsule of the joint, which is attached to the margins of the articular surfaces. The joint capsule is reinforced anteriorly and posteriorly by the anterior and posterior sternoclavicular ligaments. In addition, it is reinforced inferiorly by the costoclavicular ligament. The interior of the joint cavity is divided by means of the presence of the interarticular disc, which is a fibrocartilaginous disc that divides the interior of the joint cavity into two compartments, medial and lateral compartments. The joint is innervated by the supraclavicular nerve and nerve to subclavius، على اعتبار انه subclavius راح نشوفها يعني rises from the first costal cartilage and first rib، فهي كلش يعني adjacent to the sternoclavicular joint. فمن راح يجي النيرف subclavius ينطي للsternoclavicular joint همينة توج to innervate the joint. So innervation of sternoclavicular joint is achieved via supraclavicular and nerve to subclavius muscle. Movements which are possible at the joint, at the medial compartment, forward and backward movement of the clavicle, while at the lateral compartment, elevation and depression of the clavicle. Acromioclavicular joint. من اسمه between articulation takes place between acromion of scapula and lateral end of the clavicle. Also, it is a plain type of synovial joints in which the lateral end of the clavicle articulates with the acromion of scapula. In the same way to the sternoclavicular joint, the joint cavity is surrounded by a fibrous tissue which is called the capsule of the joint, and it is attached to the margins of the articular surfaces. Now the joint capsule is reinforced superiorly and inferiorly by the superior and inferior acromioclavicular ligaments. In addition to that, the acromioclavicular joint is reinforced by the presence of corococlavicular ligament, which arises from coracoid process of scapula by its two parts, the conoid part and trapezoid part, to be inserted into the inferior aspect or surface of the lateral part of the clavicle. The acromioclavicular joint is innervated by the suprascapular nerve, and it permits a sliding movement على اعتبار هو يعني plain synovial joint. Shoulder joint. It is a ball and socket synovial joint in which the upper rounded end of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity. The articular surfaces are covered by a layer of hyaline cartilage and the glenoid cavity is deepened by the presence of the glenoid labrum, which is a fibrocartilaginous rim attached to the margins of the glenoid cavity. طبعا هي يعني طالعه هنا كانه triangular in shape، بس بالحقيقه هي ring around the margin على اعتبار احنا هنا ماخذ coronal section فطالعه just like a ring. The joint cavity is surrounded by a fibrous capsule which is lax and thin to allow a wide range of movement. The capsule is reinforced by the fibrous slips that are derived from the tendons of rotator cuff muscles, anteriorly subscapularis, superiorly supraspinatus, and posteriorly infraspinatus anterospine muscle. The shoulder joint is innervated by axillary and suprascapular nerves. In order to increase the stability of shoulder joints, in addition to the presence of the tendons of rotator cuff muscles in front, above and behind the joint capsule, the joint capsule is reinforced by the presence of the ligaments around the shoulder joint, and these are the glenohumeral ligaments, which are three weak bands of fibrous tissue present in front of the capsule of shoulder joint. In fact, these are thickening in the capsule of the shoulder joint. So this is the superior glenohumeral, middle glenohumeral, and this is the inferior glenohumeral ligament. The second ligament is the transverse humeral ligament, which crosses between the greater and lesser tuberosity of the humerus, holding down the tendon of long head of biceps in position. Finally, the coracoacromial ligament, which crosses between the tip of coracoid process and the tip of acromion of scapula, forming an arch above the superior aspect of shoulder joint and support it. Movements which is performed by shoulder joint represented by flexion, which is performed by anterior fibers of deltoid, pectoralis major, biceps, and coracobrachialis. Extension, which is performed by posterior fibers of deltoid, latissimus dorsi, and teres major muscle. Abduction, which is performed by middle fibers of deltoid، أو قلنا عليها نسميها هي lateral fibers of deltoid assisted by supraspinatus. وإحنا بأصور بواحد من المختبرات قلنا supraspinatus here initiate the movement of abduction and hold the head of the humerus against the glenoid cavity. Adduction, which is performed by pectoralis major, latissimus dorsi, teres major, and teres minor muscles. Lateral rotation, which is performed by infraspinatus, teres minor, posterior fibers of deltoid muscle. Medial rotation, which is performed by subscapularis, latissimus dorsi, teres major, pectoralis major, and anterior fibers of deltoid. واحنا تذكرون حكينا قلنا يعني according to the origin and insertion of these muscles we can understand the function of the muscles easily. Circumduction هو combination of the above movements. Elbow joint. It is a hinge type of synovial joint in which the trochlea and capitulum of the humerus articulates with the trochlear notch of ulna and head of radius inferiorly, respectively. The articular surfaces are covered by a hyaline cartilage, and the joint cavity is surrounded by a fibrous joint capsule, which is attached in the front above to the humerus, in front of medial epicondyle of the humerus, margins of coronoid and radial fossae, and in front of the lateral humeral epicondyle, while below it is attached to the margins of coronoid process of ulna and upper margin of annular ligament which surround the head of radius at the level of proximal radioulnar joint. While posteriorly the fibrous capsule is attached from above to the back of the lateral humeral epicondyle margins of olecranon fossa and back of the medial humeral epicondyle, while inferiorly it's attached to the sides and upper margin of olecranon process of ulna and the upper margin of the annular ligament that surround the head of radius. The capsule of shoulder joint is lined by a thin, delicate membrane which is called the synovial membrane that's continuous downward with the joint cavity of the proximal radioulnar joint. فاحنا نريد تخلون ببالكم انه joint cavity of elbow is continuous with the joint cavity of the proximal radioulnar joint. The joint capsule of elbow joint is reinforced by medial and lateral collateral ligaments أو نسميها lateral radial ligament and medial annular ligament. So the lateral collateral ligament is triangular in shape. Its apex attached to the lateral humeral epicondyle while the base is attached to the upper margin of annular ligament. The medial collateral ligament also is triangular in shape and consists of three bands: an anterior band, posterior band, and a transverse band. Anterior band crosses between the medial humeral epicondyle and the medial side of coronary process of ulna, while the posterior band crosses between medial humeral epicondyle and the medial side of olecranon process of ulna. The transverse band connect the two bands, anterior and posterior bands. Movements which are possible at the level of elbow joint here flexion and extension. But keep in mind that the flexion movement is limited by the anterior surfaces of the arm and forearm when they are coming into contact. Flexion is performed by brachialis, biceps, coracobrachialis, and pronator teres muscles, while extension is performed by triceps and anconeus muscles. Now, the long axis of the fully extended forearm make an angle with the long axis of the arm, and this angle which opens laterally is called the carrying angle, and it is in male about 170 degree and in female about 167 degree. This angle disappears when the elbow is fully flexed، وهذا الشيء اللي يخلي يعني carrying object easier for us. يعني احنا لما نجرب نشيل شيء لما نسوي extension نريد شوي الفورر مالتنا والهاند away from our body، فهذه هي الكارينج انجل اللي راح تساعدنا انه نقدر carry objects with our hands. Relations of the elbow joint. Anteriorly, elbow joint is related to brachialis, biceps, median nerve, termination of radial nerve, and brachial artery. وإحنا قلنا termination of brachial artery يكون against the neck of radius يعني approximately, and termination of radial nerve يكون in the cubital fossa just anterior to the lateral humeral epicondyle. Posteriorly, elbow joint related to triceps muscle and the bursa in the nearby position. Medially, the ulnar nerve which crosses behind the medial humeral epicondyle and descends on the medial ulnar collateral ligament, while laterally the common extensor tendons and supinator muscle. Elbow joint is innervated by median nerve, ulnar nerve, radial nerve, and musculocutaneous nerve. the proximal radioulnar joint. It is a pivot type of synovial joint in which articulation takes place between the round head of radius and the radial notch on the lateral proximal part of ulna. The joint cavity is surrounded by a fibrous joint capsule which is attached to the margins of the articulating surfaces, and it is continuous above with that of elbow joint. Now the joint capsule is reinforced by the annular ligament which is attached to the radial notch attached to the anterior and posterior margins of the radial notch on the lateral side of proximal ulna, and form a collar around the head of radius. The capsule of the proximal radioulnar joint is lined by a delicate membrane which is called the synovial membrane, which is continuous with the synovial membrane lining the joint cavity of elbow joint. The proximal radioulnar joint permits pronation and supination movements, and it is innervated by median nerve, radial nerve, ulnar nerve, and musculocutaneous nerve. The proximal radioulnar joint is related anteriorly to supinator muscle and radial nerve, and posteriorly related to supinator and common extensor. The distal radioulnar joint is also a pivot type of synovial joint in which articulation takes place between the rounded head of ulna and the ulnar notch on the lower medial side of radius. The joint cavity is surrounded by a joint capsule which is deficient superiorly and reinforced by anterior and posterior ligament. A triangular fibrocartilaginous disc, which is often referred to as the articulate disc, attached by its apex to the lateral side of the base of the styloid process of ulna, and by its base into the lower border of ulnar notch of radius. It shoots off the distal radioulnar joint from the wrist joint and strongly unite radius to ulna. The capsule of distal radioulnar joint is lined by a synovial membrane, and the joint is innervated by the median and radial nerve via the anterior and posterior interosseous nerves. The movements which are possible at the distal radioulnar joint are supination and pronation movement. The distal radioulnar joint is related anteriorly to the tendons of flexor profundus, while posteriorly to the tendon of extensor digiti minimi. Wrist joint. It is an ellipsoid type of synovial joint in which articulation takes place between the distal radius and the articular disc above and the scaphoid lunate triquetral bones below. The proximal articular surfaces form an ellipsoid convex surface which accommodates for the ellipsoid convex articular surfaces of the scaphoid lunate triquetral bones. The joint capsule surrounds the joint cavity and is attached above to the ends of radius and ulna, while below it is attached to the proximal rows of the carpal bones. The joint capsule is reinforced by anterior and posterior ligaments, in addition to the medial and lateral collateral ligaments. The medial collateral ligament is stretched between the styloid process of ulna and the triquetral bone, while the lateral collateral ligament is stretched between the styloid process of radius and the scaphoid bone. The joint capsule is lined by a synovial membrane which does not communicate with the synovial membrane or with the joint cavity of the distal radial ulnar joint. In addition to that, it does not communicate with the joint cavities of the intercarpal joints. Wrist joint is innervated by the anterior and posterior interosseous nerves, which are branches of the median and radial nerves. The movements which are possible at the level of the wrist joint include flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Flexion is performed by flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, and palmaris longus. These muscles are assisted by the long flexor muscles of the hand, which are represented by flexor digitorum superficialis profundus and flexor pollicis longus, while extension is performed by the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, and these muscles are assisted by the long extensors of the fingers, which are represented by extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and extensor pollicis longus, and finally extensor index. Abduction is performed by the flexor carpi radialis and extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, and these muscles are assisted by abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis longus and brevis, while adduction is performed by flexor and extensor carpi ulnaris. Relations of wrist joint. Wrist joint is anteriorly to the tendons of flexor digitorum profundus and superficialis, tendon of flexor pollicis longus, tendon of flexor carpi ulnaris and radialis, median nerve, ulnar artery, and ulnar nerve, while posteriorly it is related to tendons of extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digiti minimi, extensor digitorum, extensor indicis, extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor pollicis longus and brevis, and finally abductor pollicis longus. Medially, wrist joint is related to the dorsal cutaneous branch of ulnar nerve, while laterally the radial artery in the snap box. Joints of the hand and fingers. These are represented by intercarpal joints, carpometacarpal joints, intermetacarpal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, and finally interphalangeal joints. The intercarpal joints are plain type of synovial joints in which the articulation takes place between the individual bones of the proximal row of carpus. In addition to the articulation between the individual bones of the distal row of carpus, and finally between the proximal and distal rows of the carpal bone at the level of mid-carpal joint. These joints permit small amount of sliding movement. هو هذا المetacarpal bone. This is the head of metacarpal. This is proximal phalanx, and this is the middle, and this is the distal phalanx. So this is the metacarpophalangeal joint, and now this is the interphalangeal proximal and distal interphalangeal joints. These are plain synovial joints which permit small amount of gliding movement. The carpometacarpal and intermetacarpal joints also are example of plain synovial joints which possess an anterior, posterior, and interosseous ligaments. They have a common joint cavity and permit a small amount of sliding movement. Carpometacarpal and intermetacarpal joints. The carpometacarpal joint of the thumb is a saddle type of synovial joint. راح يختلف عن الباقيات اللي هم plain, in which articulation takes place between the trapezium and the first metacarpal bone of the thumb. The joint is surrounded by a lax joint capsule, which is lined by a synovial membrane. Movement of the first carpal metacarpal bone: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and apposition, which is done by the opponent's pollicis muscle. Metacarpophalangeal joints. These are type of condyloid synovial joints in which articulation takes place between the rounded heads of metacarpal bones with the bases of the proximal phalanges. And this type of joint characterized by having two convex surfaces that articulates with two concave surfaces. So this is a coronal section at the finger showing the convex surface of the head of metacarpal from side to side. And this is a sagittal section at the finger showing the convex surface of head of metacarpal from front to back. So from front to back convex, and from side to side convex. The two convex surfaces articulates with two concave surfaces from side to side of the proximal phalanx, and from front to back also concave surface of the proximal phalanx. So this type of joint characterized by having two concave surfaces that articulate with two concave surfaces, and it's called condyloid synovial joint. And these joints surrounded by a joint capsule and lined by a synovial membrane. طبعا the articular surfaces here covered by a hyaline, thin layer of hyaline cartilage. The movement which are possible at the level of the metacarpophalangeal joint are flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and small amount of rotational movement. Flexion is performed by lumbricals and the interossei, assisted by the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus, while extension is performed by extensor digitorum, extensor indicis, and extensor digiti minimi. Abduction is performed by the dorsal interossei. Adduction is performed by the palmar interossei. In case of a metacarpophalangeal joint of thumb, flexion is performed by flexor pollicis longus and brevis, while extension is performed by extensor pollicis longus and brevis. The movement of flexion and adduction are performed at the level of carpometacarpal joint. Interphalangeal joint are the synovial joint of hinge type, which permit flexion and extension. Sagittal section through the lateral part of elbow joint, showing the olecranon process of ulna, olecranon fossa of a humerus, head of radius, coronoid process of ulna, trochlear notch, and this is the humerus, and this is the lower part of a humerus. الحقيقة احنا ما راح نسميه هل هو capitate لو trochlear، لأنه طالعت لنا trochlear notch والhead of radius at the same level. Could be capitate, could be could be capitulum, could be trochlear. And now this is triceps muscle, brachialis muscle. البايسبس ورا مجال section قطع عن التندن مالتها فطلعت بس belly of biceps. And now this is brachioradialis muscle and supinator muscle. In summary, shoulder, elbow, wrist joints are the main joints of the upper limb. Shoulder joint is a ball and socket synovial joint that permits a great degree of movement. Elbow joint is reinforced by medial and lateral collateral ligaments. The head of ulna is excluded from wrist joint by the articular disc. The carpometacarpal of thumb is a saddle type of synovial joint which has a great range of movement. وشكرا لكم ونتمنى لكم التوفيق بامتحاناتكم إن شاء الله. Good luck.